it would help if I turn the microphone on. Sorry about that, everybody. That was a pretty important thing to do. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to do that. Hey, like I said, only to myself just a couple minutes ago, this whole live stream thing is new to us. This is only the second one we've ever done. So, these things are going to happen. Now, to go back to where I started, I was just pointing out at the very beginning that we're trying something new today. I've actually decided to put a second camera just to show you what the process looks like. And so this is what my whole setup looks like. I'm busy talking to this camera right here. That's where you are. But I've got lights around me. I've got my table with my notes. I can even see myself on the screen right there. So anyways, thank you so much for pointing that out in the chat that you couldn't hear me. Now, since we're talking about the chat right now, please let us know where you're connecting from today. We had a decent number of people RSVP to this. Hopefully they got their links in time. Hopefully they come and join us in the next few minutes. But please share in the chat where you're from. I'm obviously here in Karameas at the Gristmillen Gardens, and I'm really excited to be doing this presentation for you. The truth is, I'm not the expert. There are people out there that know way more than me on this topic. This is just meant to get you started, and I hope it helps. So, as I was saying before, my name's Chris. I'm the general manager here at the Grist Mill. I've been here for a dozen years, and I have had the privilege over that dozen years of taking care of this incredible piece of heritage that has gardens as a core component of it. And so I think it was my second year here, we had a group of university students come through and actually do a pretty detailed survey of the ground nesting bees that we had on site. They were actually looking at the whole Similkameen Valley, and it was really interesting because they found more variety of species here on this property than anywhere else that they looked in the Karameas and Costin area. There were lots of reasons for that. One was we had a big diversity of landscapes here. We've got an arid area up top. We've got the creek running through, and it's a riparian environment. We've got cultivated gardens. We've got other wild spaces. And when you put it all together, it was really, really good for the particular kinds of pollinators that they were looking for. And that whole experience left a real impression on me at how valuable this piece of property was, not just by its history and the old things that were on it, the stories that I could tell there, but it's a piece of the natural landscape. And so out of that, we've done a lot of other work to do things like protect the riparian area. We've signed voluntary covenants to make sure that we're protecting around our creek and things like that. So I am interested in talking today about pollinators, in particular, how you can support them yourself. Now, over the next hour or so, we're going to talk about a variety of things. We're going to be talking about some of the pollinators that might visit your garden and why they matter. We're going to talk about why pollinator gardens are so important for our communities and the environment. We're going to talk about choosing pollinator-friendly plants and being mindful in your choices, because not everybody has your area's best interest at heart. Just because something says it's pollinator friendly doesn't mean that it's actually perfect for you. So we're gonna talk a little about that. We're gonna talk about some ways to create the best habitat possible to have a wide diversity of pollinators. And when we finish up, we'll talk a little bit about some community resources that are out there, ways to get involved, ways to learn more, some of the organizations that exist out there that really, really care about this stuff. So hopefully by the end of this workshop, this presentation tonight, you're going to go away with enough knowledge to know what the right questions are to ask next. Give you the right information to go through seed catalogs or find the resources to give you an idea on the kinds of things you might be interested in planting in your own gardens to help support pollinators. And yeah, I'm going to be sharing, obviously, a lot of talking head stuff, and I apologize for that. There are some different visuals that I'll be pulling into this shortly as well. Now, if you want to interact with me, the best way by far is just to say something in the chat. I'm keeping kind of half an eye on the chat. I might not see it right away because I'm also got my notes. I'm trying to look at the camera to make eye contact with all of you special people. But ultimately, hopefully I'll see some of those, like when I didn't have my microphone turned on earlier. Now, make sure your volume is set comfortably. If you have any streaming issues, just reload the page. If you're on YouTube, just reload the page. It should solve all the problems. We have an amazing internet connection here. We're really privileged to have very, very good internet here at the Gristmill Gardens now. So hopefully none of us have any problems. All right. Now, first thing we should probably talk about is what a pollinator actually is. And a pollinator at its core is mostly an insect, but not always, that helps move pollen around a landscape. Now, pollinators come in many shapes and sizes. We're most familiar with bees. When you think of pollinators, the first thing you're going to think of is bees. If you just have a basic knowledge, you're going to think honeybees. If you have slightly more knowledge, you might go, oh, and well, there's bumblebees. There's the native bumblebees. Oh, and there's mason bees. But then you get into butterflies. You get into beetles are actually a pretty common pollinator. You have hummingbirds. You have many different species that visit a garden, help spread pollen around. Now, why is that so important? Well, one of the big things is pollen is what makes your garden go. Moving pollen from one flower to another is what allows seeds and fruit to take shape. And we want to support that, first of all, just in the interest of our own gardens, but we also want to make sure that we are supporting those pollinators who are doing a heck of a lot more than just taking care of our garden. They're taking care of the natural landscape. They're taking care of all the wild trees out there. You wouldn't have a mountain ash tree full of berries for the birds in the fall if it wasn't for pollinators doing their job. You wouldn't have the apples and the pears and the wine grapes and all of those things if it weren't for pollinators doing their job. Now, not everything is pollinated by an insect or an animal. For example, corn actually does a pretty good job of just pollinating using the wind. It's one of the challenges when you grow corn actually is that you have to keep corn very far apart to keep two different varieties that happen to bloom at the same time from cross-pollinating. It's one of the really hard things about growing corn for seeds is you've got to keep that isolation because it's so good at spreading its pollen on the wind. Most other plant species aren't that lucky. Now, as it happens, we have a particular kind of plant here at the gristmill, something called a zucca. They're giant gourds originally from Africa. They grow 120, 140 pounds each. And unfortunately, what pollinates them in their natural environment in Africa doesn't exist here. They cannot be pollinated by the particular kind of moth that exists in Africa in its home environment. And so we have to do the job as pollinators to actually go out with a feather or a Q-tip and figure out which ones are the male flowers and get the pollen from the male flowers and carefully share it with the female flowers. Hopefully with a glass of wine and a little romantic music helping love happen. And that's what gives us our good crops of zuccas every year. Now, we know that one of the biggest strengths to an ecosystem is a diversity of life. The wider the diversity of life we have in an ecosystem, the more resilient it is, the more able it is to handle all the bumps and bruises. And let's be honest, these days, with the way the environment is going a little haywire, we've had a few really, really difficult winters in a row. This one is a little weird in its own way. I actually noticed coming in today, it's July 15th, and I walked past a rose that is actually trying to bloom. The bud formed back in late October, and it's been cool enough that it hasn't opened up yet. It is taking any warmth it can get, and it's actually trying to open on January 15th. So the wider the diversity of life that we have, the more different kinds of pollinators we support in our gardens and in our environment, the more resilient our entire landscape is going to be. And so when you are thinking about how to plan your own garden and the kinds of pollinators that you want to support, it's really, really important to remember that you actually want to cater to a lot. You don't want to just have a honeybee garden. You want to have something that's going to be drawing in honeybees and bumblebees and hoverflies and butterflies and, yes, beetles and all of the others, hummingbirds, all of the species, as many as possible, because it provides resilience. And that is so, so important in these really challenging times. Now, I think next, let's talk a little bit about specific, some of the specific pollinators that we find here in BC. And I'd really like to thank an organization, a project out of UBC Okanagan that's gone a little dormant in the last couple of years, but did some really amazing things, called Border Free Bees. It was part education, part art installation. Some really amazing people have been involved in it, and they've created some fantastic resources. And so this resource that I have up right now is a wonderful guide that they have. And let me get into it. So we're not going to flip through every page. There's lots to see in this document, though. But we're going to go straight ahead right into, well, there's basic bee anatomy right there, if you're curious. I'll be providing more information on how to find this yourself later. But let's talk specifically first about the honeybee. Because if you live in a place that has any kind of agriculture happen, there are a lot of honeybees around. In fact, you go even look in our gardens, and a significant portion of the things buzzing around on any particular day in the summertime are honeybees. Now, honeybees make honey. That's what makes them honeybees. But most honeybees that we see out there are working. They're not there naturally. They're not there in the wild. Most honeybees that we see are actually coming from dedicated hives that are often moved around agricultural areas to help pollinate large commercial crops. The apples, the cherries, the other plants that grow here in the Similkameen are supported very heavily by honeybees. They're majorly important for our economy. But they aren't necessarily native to the area. They can push out other kinds of bees that are equally as important, not necessarily providing us as much tasty honey or as much support for our farming industry and economy, but you may still want to support honeybees. Now, honeybees have a pretty standard look. You've seen them plenty of times before. You'll notice the pollen baskets, as they're called, on their legs. Those help collect pollen and help move it around from place to place. So these are what they look like. There's a pollen basket, right there, to give you an idea. So they get right in there, they're busy drinking nectar, and out of that they're moving pollen around. Then you've got bumblebees. Bumblebees range dramatically in size, they range dramatically in shape, but they're the big fuzzy bees that look unaerodynamic. They look like they shouldn't even be able to fly. They're just so awkward and big and fuzzy. And they come in a variety of colors. There's a number of different species there. More than you would expect, but they are much rounder. They are generally a pretty decent size, and they look a lot like this. So instead of being smoother like the honeybees, they have nice fuzz. You almost want to pet them. They're just so darn cute. Here's some more. There are many, as I said, many different species of bumblebee. If you've got a camera with a really good lens and you start taking pictures, you can teach yourself pretty quickly about the different varieties. Then you've got other kinds of solitary bees. You know, these are bees that don't have hives. These are bees that, mostly live independently. We would sometimes refer to them as mason bees or leafcutter bees or resin bees. These are all in this family. And they are a smaller bee, of course, and they look like this. So these are just some examples. So we've got 2 leafcutter bees here and 1 carder bee. Here's what some mason bees look like. Now, supporting mason bees is valuable, and you will find a lot of garden centers selling you mason bee homes. And they're really just collections of lots of tube-like indentations. You see, in nature, you've got other insects that bore into trees, for example, and create tunnels. Well, mason bees love to find those kinds of places and live in them. So by providing extra through, little bamboo or cardboard tubes, you can provide them with additional homes. The challenge is people don't always maintain their mason bee homes, and that's not good for the mason bees. You still got to clean up the house every once in a while. So often there's a whole process involved, but often in the winter you'll dismantle your mason bee home. You remove the cocoons. You can store them in your fridge. That's fine. They'll stay dormant. And then you can clean the tubes, reinsert them in the tubes when it's time before it's time to put them outside. There's a whole process to it. I'm not going to get into those details right now, but providing dedicated mason bee homes is not an awful thing. They're called mason bees, by the way, because they tend to use a little bit of mud to seal the hole behind them. So once they go in and cocoon, they will seal that up. So it's like working with mortar if you're working as a actual mason. Now there's mining bees here, or different kinds of different kinds of ground nesting bees, and again they have different looks. Like you might find some of the green metallic bees, or others like these guys. Now they're short-tongued bees, so they're not as effective at certain plants that are deeper. They can't get in there the same way, but they still move a lot of pollen around. Here's some more to look at. Pretty amazing, the range of. Now, hoverflies are interesting because they look a lot like bees until you look at them the right way, and then you realize their bodies are squished flat because they don't actually have a big body the way a bee does, but they're meant to mimic bees. They're meant to look like bees, so the predators won't be interested in them. And let me show you what those look like. So you can see on the body of the hoverfly on the left there, it is a fly, but it's meant to look like a bee, so that hopefully it gets left alone. And they're called hoverflies because they hover a lot around different flowers in your garden. Now, of course, bees and things we would call bees or that look like bees are just some of the pollinators. We also have butterflies. And supporting butterflies is important for a lot of different reasons. We hear a lot about monarchs. Now, the truth is there are very, very few monarch sightings in the Okanagan-Similkameen. We're just not part of their common travel path these days. In my 12 years here, I've seen 4 total over 3 different years. I see other butterflies instead that are sometimes confused. They're not the same at all if you put them side by side, but people still think of them as being similar. Now, often what are confused for monarchs are things like the tiger swallowtail or any of the swallowtail species. They're nowhere near as orange. At least the painted lady is more orange, but it's still not quite the bright solid orange and black and white that you would expect from a monarch. Here are some other species as well. You've got the cabbage whites. Those are very common around here. We see those a lot of times. We see here at the gristmill a lot of fritillaries. We see morning cloaks. They're often the very first ones to show up in the springtime. But the bulk of the ones that we see, because they're big, they're flashing, they're common, are the swallowtails, the yellow and the western swallowtails. Now, wasps, which are different than bees, are also often provide pollination service in gardens and in landscapes. One of the big differences between a wasp and a bee when you're looking at them is that wasps have a waist, have a very, very obvious waist. And so you can see that in the picture. And don't they just, yellow jackets, paper wasps, hornets, all part of the wasp family, and all with, I won't say bad attitudes because they don't actually, but they do provide a lot of pollinator service to your gardens. So that's hopefully just a quick examples of some of the different kinds of lots of different kinds of pollinators. Now, I've just had to switch over here, back over to our video, so I can finally see the chat again. That's great. Let me go now and switch back to me. Okay. So I'll show you in a little bit where you can gain access to that particular resource online. If you want to learn more about specific bees, there's a ton of information out there. Now, the next resource that I want to introduce you to, I don't have the easy ability right this second to pull it up on screen the same way I did before, but here is, I printed it off. This is an absolutely fantastic resource. Let me put it right there. Okay, selecting plants for pollinators, courtesy of the Pollinator Partnership of Canada. And this one is great because it actually focuses on our region, on the Thompson Okanagan Plateau, which is our general area. And it has a ton of useful information in it. For example, one of the very, very first things near the beginning is a wonderful chart on the traits that different pollinators are interested in. If you want to support bees, the plants that bees are going to be interested in are bright white, yellow, blue, or glow in the ultraviolet, right? They are, plants with fresh, mild, pleasant odors are going to be popular with bees. Meanwhile, beetles, which are another pollinator, tend to prefer really strong smelling plants. Many beetle species are drawn to things like corpses or rotting fruit or strong smells. So strong smells in your garden are going to tend to draw beetles. Beetles love pollen as well, and they tend to be attracted to large bowl-shaped fruit. So there's lots and lots of that information here. And it covers bees, beetles, birds, butterflies, flies, moths, and even wind pollinated. But it also, more importantly, talks quite extensively about the kind of conditions you want to create in your garden. So, first and most importantly is species selection. What species are you going to put in your garden or in your yard to help support pollinators? Some are very well known. For example, you've probably heard that if you want to support butterflies, particularly monarchs, you want to have milkweed. Milkweed is an important food source for the larvae stage of monarchs and other butterflies. They contribute significantly. The downside of milkweed is that it can go a little nuts. It is weedy. I hate that word because a weed is just a plant in a place you don't want it. Maybe an aggressive plant you don't want. But I strongly encourage planting milkweed. Just be aware that it's going to go everywhere because its feathery seeds are going to float in the air, kind of like dandelion, and end up everywhere. But they're really important, especially for butterfly type species, and they're really beautiful looking. Unfortunately, this is something that I alluded to at the very beginning. When you're deciding what species to put in, you have to understand that there is a difference between cultivated species and native species to your area. And we tend to fill our gardens with species that aren't native to our area. And what that does is that is often more challenging for our native pollinators. Our native pollinators aren't necessarily as interested in the prettiest flower that you bought from the nursery. They might be kind of interested in it. They might be very interested in it, but there's no guarantee. Learning what species exist in your environment naturally and encouraging some of those is always going to help the native pollinators significantly. Honeybees, that are coming from hives that are doing other pollinator work, they're just happy with whatever they can get. If they've got access to dandelions, they're going to take it. If they've got access to roses or, other kinds of plants, they're going to take it. If they can find buckwheat, if they can find apple blossoms, they are just happy to get whatever nectar they can. They'll do the pollinating on the side. You're good to go. So the first thing you have to really think about is, what balance do you want to create in your own garden of native species versus cultivated species? There is, like I said before, really great resources. Your local garden club will probably know somebody who can help you with that. If you have access to any of the CD Saturday events that happen in the Okanagan or in your region, reach out to the Okanagan Master Gardeners, who often show up at those events and other things. There are many, many different resources to access to find out what native species you could plant, what cultivated species you could plant. And then the sort of third category there are the really, really invasive species. This is something that is tricky when it comes to looking in a seed catalog, for example. You go into your favorite seed catalog and you see, oh, look, they've got a pollinator mix. Well, that sounds like a great thing. I should plant that. And your heart's in the right place and you're doing the right thing, except, unfortunately, those are not necessarily the right things for where you are, number one. Number two, they might include species that are going to run away from you. One of the species I've seen in pollinator mixes before is baby's breath, is gypsophilia. That stuff runs wild and can cause real problems. It's considered pretty invasive. We have to be careful about those things. We have to educate ourselves before we do that. So, picking which species you want to put in your yard, in your garden, that's step number one. Now, step number two is creating layers. Different pollinators have different interests, different places they like to nest and hide and so on. And so the more thought you put into creating structure in your garden, and it can even be things as simple as, don't rake the leaves out of your garden in the spring. Leave them around the edges of your garden for a while, because things are living in there. Insects are living in there. Pollinators are going to get their very first chance of the season to wake up and stretch their legs and warm up under that bed of leaves or twigs or things like that. Maybe your garden is designed so that it has a nice thick ground cover and something that grows a little above that. And thinking in terms of layers at different levels helps provide a diversity of environments which supports a diversity of pollinators. So that's number two, is thinking in terms of the structure of your garden. Now, item number three, some pollinators really appreciate access to water. Some have no problem finding it themselves, but we live in a semi-arid landscape here in the Similkameen, and so having access to water is not a bad thing. But if you're something the size of a bee, you have to realize that something like a bird bath is just not going to work. It is not going to work at all for something little and delicate. I mean, a little gust of wind could push that pollinator right into the water, or they could drown. So there are many, many different ways to do things, like put pebbles in a shallow pool. So the pebbles provide lots of landing opportunity, and the water is sort of between the pebbles. This is just one example of many of ways that you can try and provide water space. The truth is, your landscape probably already has a diversity of species, probably has some sort of shelter for some pollinators, has access to water. But by being aware of those three things, hopefully you can make it even more conducive. As I said before, if you want to do something like buy a mason bee house, that's fine. But know that there's responsibility with caring for it. It's like when you get a hummingbird feeder, while you think you're doing a nice thing for the hummingbirds, if you're not keeping it clean, if you're not keeping it refilled, if you're not watching for things like mold growth or ants visiting, or honestly, I've actually seen, praying mantises set up on hummingbird feeders and take down hummingbirds. It's amazing that a mantis can do this, but it can. So if you're going to be introducing these things into your landscape, it is incumbent on you to take responsibility for them. All right. Now I've been talking for a while, and I noticed that the chat has gotten a little quiet. I would love, questions maybe if you've got them, or if you've got comments about anything that I'm saying, or if there's something I can expand on. Please, at any point, add that to the chat. I would really, really appreciate that. All right. Now, one of the biggest services that we can provide in our own... number one of the three things. The first thing was choosing appropriate species. Cultivated are fine, but native species are better. Number two is providing shelter and structure in your garden. And number three is providing water. Okay? Now, as a more general principle, there's a few other things that I would love to mention. One of them is a really tidy garden is bad for pollinators. And by tidy, I mean well manicured. If you live in a with a lawn that's manicured like a golf course, and all of your hedges are perfectly trimmed, and all of your plants are in a perfect row, this is not conducive to pollinators. Pollinators need a diversity, and so doing things like having parts of your grass that grow longer, that you're not pulling dandelions out of, because honestly, dandelions are often the first food for a lot of pollinator species in the springtime, and by getting rid of those right away, you're starving them at a time when they're waking up in the spring and they're desperate to feed, and at least they've got that. Maybe they've got violets, but they've got to tide themselves over with those things for weeks until apple blossoms open up, or lilacs open up, or daffodils open up, or other species like that. So make sure that you're aware of the impact that your work to make your beautiful garden perfect might have. Don't clean up the leaf litter too early, right? That's a good natural mulch. Don't over groom your yard. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about briefly, I like that. Just reading in the chat. I've read that native bees get their water from the flowers themselves. That is true, through the dew and the nectar, and don't actually need a pebble water dish. That is true. This was sparked by little water cups marketed for bees, sold online. And this is the thing, right? The instinct to want to take care of our yards and our natural environment and pollinators is a good one. It's a powerful one. My mother always used to say, don't poop on anybody trying to do a good thing. But at the same time, some of these things can be counterproductive. Having species that look pretty but don't actually support native pollinators, for example, as we've talked about. Species that can get away on you, another good example. Some of the weird and wonderful contraptions and things. Don't get me started talking about the flow hive. That one just bugs the heck out of me, but anyways. If you're not familiar, flow hive is a honeybee hive that actually has knobs, and you actually basically kind of break the hive in a way that the honey just flows out of it. It's weird. All right, so back to this particular document that I was talking about before. Let me pull this back up so I can make sure. Now, one of the really great things in this that you can find online is a very detailed chart about halfway through of plants that attract pollinators in our region. And it's very well broken down. I'm going to try and show you some of this here. So it has botanical name, common name, height. This is just the first page. This is just trees and shrubs. The kind of soil, the kind of sun, its flowering season, which pollinators it attracts, and is it also a host? Because it's one thing to just service, pollinators by providing them with nectar and pollen. There are also other life stages. So, for example, a butterfly also has a larvae stage. And one of the reasons that milkweed is so important is that it provides a host stage for the larvae, for the caterpillars. They love eating the milkweed, and then they build their cocoons, and then they metamorphosize into butterflies. So this document right here has trees and has a very extensive chart on trees and shrubs, forbs, which are different kinds of flowers and such. So, for example, I saw somebody mention blanket flower. We've got where is it? Right here. Blanket flower is right there. And it supports bees, beetles, butterflies, etc., etc. It talks about vines. It talks about other shelter plants, which are things like grasses, places for them to hide. And then it also has this wonderful chart of bee-pollinated garden flowers and crops. And you can find out exactly what species pollinate which kinds of plants, which can be very useful for you if you have particular things you're wanting to grow and encourage, and you're curious about what particular species to help support along the way. So, a brief checklist. If you're taking notes today, good for you. If you're not, I'll try and get this posted up later so that you can come back to it. But if you are taking notes, here's a basic checklist. A basic checklist of some things to think about. So first, the acronym is SHARE. And SHARE stands for Simply Have Areas Reserved for the Environment. Don't think about cultivating your entire yard. Think about planting for pollinators. Think about making pollinator habitat a priority for you. Connect with others in your neighborhood and try and make sure that they're maybe filling gaps. If you're actually a farmer, you can even get certified as a bee-friendly farm. And there's lots of interesting information about that. Now, next spring, when things warm up and things start to bloom, become familiar with pollinators in your landscape. Make the effort to get out there and watch your garden. See what comes and visits. Make notes. Maybe just a quick little tally sheet. Oh, that's a honeybee. Oh, that's a bumblebee. Oh, that's a mason bee. That's a hoverfly. That's a butterfly. Start to get an idea of what is visiting your garden. Because if you want to have the most diverse garden with the most different kinds of pollinators, it's good to know what's not visiting now, and then adapting what you're doing in the future to try and accommodate that. There are some really, really cool citizen science programs out there associated with pollinator study. They have wonderful resources. You can even buy now cool little cameras that use, I won't call it AI, but basically use machine learning to help identify what's flying around in your garden, using sound as well as visuals. You can also consult local field guides or local resources, but become familiar with what pollinators are around, and especially take a look at the ones that might be at risk. Which ones are red listed or yellow listed, which means they're at very high risk of disappearing. Those are the ones that we need to support the most. Make sure you're adding native plants to your garden. They are so important for the native pollinators. Maybe it's yarrow, maybe it's blanket flower, maybe it's other species, but whatever it is that's suitable for where you are. There are actually some really good nurseries in the Okanagan dedicated specifically to native plants. And so they are great resources to go in and talk to, discuss what you want to do. Now, related to pollinator support, you also want to think about does your garden provide food for pollinators through the longest possible season? Are there gaps? If we only plant 5 or 10 things in our garden, there may be periods of as long as weeks or a month where nothing is blooming, nothing is providing pollen and nectar. And so looking at our gardens, making notes, keeping track for a season to see where the gaps are, and then trying to figure out what species might be able to fill that is really, really beneficial. As I said before, you want to think in terms of structure, different heights, different shaped flowers, different colors. All of this attracts different kinds of pollinators. There are undoubtedly, lots of plants that you've never even thought about that might be able to be included. Now, one of the advantages of supporting pollinators in your garden is that some pollinators, certain kinds of wasps, for example, not only do they do a pollination job, but they also do pest control for you. Having a wide diversity of these insects in your garden, and it's not just insects, right? Because we've talked about birds and other species as well. But the wider the diversity, the more likely they're going to provide on their own some integrated pest management for you. Rather than it being a formal program, you are creating it through the diversity in your garden, and it will beat back the bad pests or crowd them out because you've got so many good ones. And as I said, tolerate a little mess. So again, the checklist was simply having areas reserved for the environment, become familiar with pollinators in your landscape, add native plants to attract more native pollinators, use pollinator-friendly landscape practices to support the pollinators you attract, and last but not least, notice and appreciate the changes that you've made. It's one thing to do all this planning, it's one thing to do all the research, it's, the excitement of getting new plants in your garden is significant. It's exciting to me too. But you got to pay attention. See what changes actually happened when you did those things. Was it as beneficial as you hoped it would be? Do you need to go in a new direction next year? The more you can be aware, the more that you can keep an eye on what's happening. Spend time in your garden, just sitting and observing, just tuning into it, the better you're going to be able to do and support pollinators. Now, there are, as I said before, a ton of amazing organizations out there. If you would like to learn more about specific resources, I think the easiest way for me to communicate with you is by email. So you're welcome to email me anytime. My email address is Chris, CHRIS, @oldgristmill.ca. So Chris @oldgristmill.ca. And I'd be happy to point you in the direction of these two documents that I've already shown to you today. So the identifying pollinators and the selecting plants. Happy to show you where both of those PDFs are. I encourage you to look up Border Free Bees. Their website is absolutely chock full of useful information. In fact, here we go right now. So here is their website, and if I can just get to that screen and scroll through it. Oops. There we are. Sorry about that. I don't know how that ended up. There we go. So it has, advice on bumblebee nest boxes. It has an illustrated guide to pollinators. They've got a bumblebee guide, planning for urban pollinators, mason bee home fact sheet, interactive poster, bee observer cards, bee hotel building advice. You even have coloring pages for mason bees. They have a ton of amazing resources on there. So border-free bees. As I said, the project seems to be dormant now. It was about 2018, 2019 when things slowed down for them. But I know it's a long-term project, and some of their art installations and some of their educational stuff is still doing well. So today, I just wanted to give you an overview. I wanted to share with you some of the reasons that taking care of pollinators is important, some of the basic things you need to think about. I'm not here to tell you exactly what species to plant. That's really going to depend on your situation, and we've got people coming from all over. So let's go back to me again. Hello again. So in summary, be thoughtful, observe, be mindful of the fact that pollinators are themselves both introduced like working honeybees, as well as native like the other bees that we've talked about, the wasps, the beetles, the hummingbirds, and so on. Diversity is key. It's incredibly important. I hope this summer to have several pollinator-related events happen here at the grist mill. One of our favorite people in the world, Lori, who, by the way, was involved on a technical level in some of these projects that I'm sharing with you. She's also an amazing human being, and if I can get her out in her bee costume, I mean, come on, how fantastic is that? So watch for that. We have other live streams that we're doing over the next few weeks related to different aspects of early season gardening. Last week we talked about seed catalogs, and so on and so forth. Right until the middle of February, I think, is our last one scheduled right now, where we talk specifically about the famous Zucca plant, the giant gourds that used to be grown in our region. We'll be stopping in mid-February because then we've got to get ready for a series of in-person events that happen all through the province. We're going to be going to about a half dozen of them. They're events called CD Saturdays. They're not all on Saturdays. Sometimes they're on Sundays. We're hosting one on March 15th. Encourage you to come out to it. It's free. There's one in Penticton. There's one in Kamloops. There's one in Kelowna. The biggest one in the province is up in Enderby. They're down on the coast. They are great places for people interested in gardens to get together, to buy and share seeds and information. I highly recommend that if there's one in your community or you can get to at least one of them, please do. Also, tomorrow, we'll be doing another live stream specifically on our plans for this coming year. This is our 40th anniversary as a heritage site. 2025 is a big deal for us, and so we have a lot of cool plans for this year. Tomorrow night, I'm going to talk about some of the amazing concerts we've got lined up for the year. We're going to be talking about our Sunday dinners. We're going to be talking about our workshops. We're going to be talking about a new gala event that we hope to do in the summertime. A Heritage Skills Festival that we're bringing. It's a brand new event. The return of our night markets. The return of some of our other community events. And some really cool projects that we've sort of been talking about just a little bit so far. Like the fact that we want to write a book. We really, really, really want to write a book this year. We're fundraising for that to help pay the costs associated with paying Kyler, our amazing miller in his mid-80s, who is just a gem, and we want to get his knowledge and his wisdom out of his head and into paper, but it takes some time and some money to do that, and so we're fundraising for that. If you like this, please Tell other people about our other live streams. Please consider supporting us by getting a season's pass so that you can visit the place in the summer, and just spread the word. So thank you so much for coming to today's live stream.